All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Monday, April 18th of 2022. Thank you for tuning into the stream here today. If this is your first time watching our show, this is a live open Q&A style show here where I answer questions from the SaberSim community about how to get better at DFS, how to build better DFS lineups with SaberSim's tools here. We've got quite a few interesting questions already on tap for our queue today, including a couple important notes on late swap on SaberSim for baseball in particular. We'll also talk a little bit about win correlation in baseball with fantasy point projections and simulations. We'll talk a little bit here about how SaberSim differentiates you from other users, and in general, why adjusting the sliders are not some of the best spots to add value in the app. I saw some questions on contest selection as well. A few others I am probably missing, so already a pretty busy show here planned for today. Looking forward to diving into this here in a moment. As always, if you have questions for me, go ahead and pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack or the YouTube chat here. And if you are watching this as a recording after it goes up on YouTube, there will be a link to join our Slack community in the description of that video. If you haven't already joined up into Slack, I recommend joining up. I always try to answer the questions that are posted in Slack first as a part of the stream here. And there's always generally pretty cool conversations going on in the other channels in Slack every single day as well. So definitely recommend joining up there. Before we get started, one other benefit to being a part of our Slack community here. We post a free sports betting play every single day from our simulations. We've been doing both baseball and basketball since both sports are going on right now. And over the weekend here, 6 bets were posted. We hit 5 of 6. Miles Michaelis let us down. Actually had a pretty good game. I think we had his strikeout under. Was the only bet in our free bet recommendations this weekend that we didn't hit. So if you're not taking advantage of those, not tailing those, or just not in the Slack community, highly recommend joining up and at least sweating out some of these picks with the rest of us here, because it's been a pretty profitable time for everybody here. We do, of course, have our paid prop betting plan ongoing here. If you want to join the waitlist to that plan, I know NBA season beginning to wrap up here, but we do have NBA finals probably going at least through June. So if you want to join the waitlist for the NBA prop betting plan, or you want to join the waitlist for our upcoming MLB prop betting plan, which will basically be the same idea as our single free bet of the day that we're posting every day, but up to 10 bets a day. DM basically anyone from the SaberSim team in Slack and let us know you want to get added to that wait list, and we will get you on the list there to get joined up. But been pretty lucrative on the prop betting side. On the DFS side, hope you guys all had a good weekend, hopefully a profitable weekend. I had to pull out the Bink Guy t-shirt. Took down the quarter contest on FanDuel yesterday with a pretty low-owned Marlin stack leveraged directly against the Zach Wheeler chalk that I was pretty proud of for cool 210 fantasy points overall. I think it would have been good for second in the main $5 GPP, which I did play. I did not max out that contest. I did play quite a few entries into that, and unfortunately, this lineup did not make it into that set that was going into the $5. But I will be satisfied and happy with my little takedown of the quarter contest on FanDuel. So I hope you guys had a good weekend overall. It was just a good weekend for sports overall as well. Watched Jordan Spieth come back from the dead to win the RBC Heritage and also kill off all of my remaining lineups. I think I had 0% Jordan Spieth. And then probably maybe the best NBA game of the season so far with the Nets and Celtics yesterday. Maybe not. Maybe that's a little dramatic, but definitely a pretty good game overall. So excited to be back here talking today, getting back into the office hours here. So that's enough chatting here. Wanted to get things going here. Let's jump into some questions. I guess the last note on the housekeeping items. If you were watching along last week and really over the past couple weeks following along with Computer Gate here, as I've been calling it, the computer upgrade is complete. We are on the new PC as of today. New specs, back into the modern era of computer technology here on the stream, hoping for a much higher performance overall on today's stream. I don't know if you guys noticed it as much as I did last week. I think watching the streams back, it seemed like everything looked pretty good, maybe a little bit slower. It was very painful on my end of trying to get through some of these streams and step through different steps on the app because my old CPU just couldn't handle it. But we should be upgraded. We should be ready to rock here today. So excited to test that out. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump into some questions. So I'm going to actually start here. This is one from Matt. And this was actually just something that was posted in the MLB channel earlier today, but I feel like it's a very good question and a very good opportunity to talk about a couple things to be aware of when you're doing your MLB late swaps here. So Matt said, has anyone noticed with MLB when you build your lineups and it spits them out, if you rebuild using the late swap feature just before the first pitch, that lineups change dramatically? Seems as with the initial build, it likes lower owned players, but doing a late swap just before the start of the game, it hammers home more of the high owned plays. Saber score drops dramatically when doing that. Has it happened to anyone else? And I wanted to just kind of mention, a little bit of why this can happen. Some potential risks associated, I guess, with baseball late swap, or not so much risks, but just things to be aware of overall. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the strategies I do to avoid this. So first of all, what happens when you are late swapping? Let me get an entries file in here. And I don't actually even have any lineups in yet, but this will still work. When you late swap at the moment on SaberSim, we will rebuild every single lineup once. So for the purposes of this, let's actually get some lineups in here first. We'll do a very quick 150 build and get some lineups in here. While this is building, I'll kind of talk a little bit about this. But when you're late swapping with SaberSim, every lineup only gets built once. So actually, this is probably a pretty good opportunity to demonstrate this. This is pre-lock at the moment. So if I was building my lineups to actually enter into the sites, I have 500 lineups in this particular pool, and I'm going to be picking out 150 from those. Right. So because every lineup has been built, because there's a much larger pool of lineups behind this, the average Saber score lineup of that, the average Saber score of every lineup in the 150 that I actually use is going to be higher because we built, that's part of the purpose of building this large pool before lock, right? We build 500 so we can more accurately determine what the best 150 to use are. And we determine what the best 150 to use are by looking at the Saber score of the lineups, right? So it makes sense. It stands to reason here that we would have a higher average Saber score lineup, just better overall lineups in our pool of 150 when we build 500. And the more lineups you build, the more true that is. You probably get a better 150 if you have a pool of 1,500. There is a certain point where there's a diminishing return there. I don't know if it would make sense to build 10,000 lineups to get your best 150, but the more lineups in your pool, the better your 150 are theoretically going to be from a Saber score standpoint. So if we load these in, let's just go ahead and put these in. And we'll just do a unique lineup into everything and download this here. Now, if we were coming into late swap, say some news breaks, right? We can come in here and we can late swap. And now we have 132 unique lineups in our pool, one in each entry. We would rebuild these 132 lineups. Now, when we go forward and late swap, every lineup just gets rebuilt once. It doesn't have a pool of lineups behind it that it's selecting from. Now, in the future, we are actually planning on building a late swap pool. Similar to what we have pre-lock. We want to give you the ability to build a larger pool around your late swap so that one, the builder can identify the best lineup to late swap to of a set of options, and two, so you can edit exposures dynamically after the build, right? That's something we want to do. For now, you're just late swapping each lineup once. So it is as if you just built before lock something like this, right? It is as if you just built every single lineup once. So your lineups that come out of this are likely to have a little bit of a lower Saber score overall. The reason this is, I would say, amplified in baseball in particular is because your sim variance slider is going to be generally pretty high. So we have a pretty decent sized slate here tonight, but overall across the board, most of the time for baseball, your sim variance is going to be very high since you're selecting very randomly. Or not even very randomly, you're selecting with very high variance in your build, different players and different lineups and different stacks to use. Your lineups, one, are going to change dramatically, most likely, and they're also probably going to have lower Saber scores after that late swap. So it can be a pretty dramatic change when you do your late swap builds. That is true of other sports as well. Sport like NBA, for example, you are still maybe a little bit more likely. You're still likely to have lineups that swap with a little bit higher variance. If you've ever done an NBA late swap, you'll often see that your exposures to your highest owned players, your highest exposed players before the build drop a little bit when you late swap, and it's for the exact same reason. For NBA, though, it's something that I'm a little less worried about because there's typically so much value added by late swapping. You get opportunities to play much higher projected players after the late swap that it outweighs any increased variance that you get from running the late swap in the first place. Baseball is a little different. If you get a different lineup than expected for the West Coast game, for example, it is not as if that team has suddenly changed the way they are projected dramatically. It's just that Nick Senzel is not in the Reds lineup, for example. I know that example specifically happened over the weekend here, right? It is not as if the Reds are now a much better team because of value that has opened up. You just need to get the right Reds lineup into your lineups. So with that said, I think there is less of a argument or less of a good reason to rebuild every single lineup you made when news breaks in baseball DFS, right? It doesn't change the slate dramatically. It doesn't even change the Reds projection dramatically when a player like Senzel is out of the lineup for them, right? The most important thing you need to do is get that particular player out of your lineup. So 2 tools I think you can do that I prefer to use when I'm doing my late swaps with baseball with SaberSim are either the quick swap tool, which very simple will just replace all out players with the next best available player. I think this can be a very useful tool to use here, or just specifically selecting a specific player and swapping to another specific player if you want to go that route. Alternatively, you can use the late swap tool, but turn this toggle on and say only swap lineups containing out players. And what this will do is it'll just stick at the value of late swapping your lineups while taking into account correlation and ownership and variance and things like that. But it'll only swap the players where we can tell a player is out. And that will reduce the risk of late swapping and rebuilding every single lineup unnecessarily, introducing a lot more variance into your lineup pool, and only swap the lineups that need to be rebuilt. So kind of wanted to explain in full here what was going on behind the scenes. But from a practical standpoint, I would say for 90+% of cases here, I think the best way, and maybe even more than that, I think the best way to handle late swap with baseball in particular, is to use this toggle and only swap your lineups where a player has gotten ruled out. Otherwise, your projections just aren't going to change dramatically enough for other teams on the slate where it's really worth swapping other lineups that have everybody in the lineup playing. So, I mean, just to kind of to just give one more example to help demonstrate this even further, right? I mean, there's situations in basketball where, you know, Giannis could get ruled out, especially in like the regular season. Giannis could get ruled out, and that would like directly affect how many lineups you wanted to play with LeBron, right? Potentially, right? Like you may completely change your lineup construction of all of your lineups that don't even roster the player that got out, or any players on the team of the player that got ruled out. That would never happen in baseball, right? Even if it was a particularly big name player. It is not as if Freddie Freeman getting a night off for the Dodgers would affect how many Rockies stacks you wanted to play. That really doesn't make any sense, because it's not. And the reason why is because that player getting ruled out for the Dodgers is not opening up some significant additional amount of value onto Dodgers stacks. It's just the next guy up. So, good point to mention here, because I think it is a bit of a departure here. If you've been playing NBA here all season long and watching this show with me and listening to me talk about how much I value late swap and how important it is, and how much I will pretty much blindly late swap before the start of every game. Baseball, I play things a little bit differently. So anyway, I think that's enough on that particular question. Let's continue to move on here. And we had a couple questions come in via email over the weekend. So I wanted to hit these couple ones here first. We'll start with this question here. And I actually think this is kind of 2 questions in one. So we'll kind of touch on both questions here. So this one says, I don't understand why the underdog is always picked when the cash lineup projections are so much higher by 20 points plus. I understand it is uniqueness, but with MLB, why not pick players only on teams projected to win. So I think there are kind of, I mentioned, I think there's kind of two questions here kind of combined into one. The first question is, why not just play the highest projected lineups here overall? Why are the GPP lineups, when you build GPP lineups, projected for less than cash lineups? So we'll talk about that here a little bit. But I wanted to kind of start with this other question that's kind of tucked in here as well of why not just play the teams that are projected to win. And the short answer to that is that, overall, a team winning the game is not very highly correlated with overall batting success in baseball in particular. If you take, for example, a situation where maybe we take this Phillies and Rockies game, right? If I told you the Phillies score 12 runs in this game and they win the game, that doesn't really give you a meaningful picture to work from in terms of determining if you want to use Rocky stacks at all. Right? The Rockies could score 11 runs and lose the game and still be an efficient stack. They may not score that many runs and maybe an inefficient stack. It doesn't really say anything about that particular team. There's not any reason to believe that the Rockies are a worse stack to use purely because they lose the game alone. Right? But there are DFS sports where that is the case. Right? If I told you that in MMA, for example, that I knew one fighter won inside the distance or something like that, I mean, you'd virtually never take the other fighter on the other side of that. Just purely by that alone. You don't even need to know anything else. If the fighter loses, you're almost certainly, 99+% of the time, you're not just willingly rostering a losing fighter into your MMA lineups. League of Legends is similar, right? You're almost never stacking a team if you knew they were going to lose. And in fact, the probability of a team losing is generally kind of a decent metric to use in determining if you want to use that team stack in your lineups. Player success in League of Legends DFS is very correlated to their team's probability of winning the game. And that just isn't really the case in terms of hitting in baseball. Another factor here, though, and I think probably the more relevant factor, is that even if it was, there's kind of two sides to this, really. Even if it was, and it may be more correlated, honestly, if you kind of did a statistical breakdown here, it's possible that win probability is more correlated with hitting success than I'm leading on. Even if it was, two things. One, there aren't situations in a sport as kind of random and noisy as baseball where there is a team that is favored so heavily that I think that's very actionable. I took a look at the money lines, the money line odds before this stream here. And it looks like the heaviest favorite on the slate here tonight is the Dodgers, who are like minus 205, at least when I looked before the stream here today, which is a 67% implied probability of them winning the game. One out of three times the Braves win anyway, and they are the biggest dog on the slate. At least, again, that was when I had just kind of checked before the stream. I mean, a 1 in 3, when you're talking about, GPP winning probabilities of beating out 10,000 or 50,000 other lineups, I am not particularly concerned about using a team that only has a 33% chance to win the game, even if hitting performance was very well correlated to the win probability of a team. But assuming that even that is still the case, right? And taking kind of all of this here, let's just assume, for example, that hitting success for a stack is very correlated to the team winning the game. And that even if, let's say, even if you had teams on the slate that only had a 10% chance to win the game, the kind of cherry on top here, or the final kind of trump card, is that because your lineups are ultimately going to be built with the simulations in mind here, right? We are not building based on average projections. We are pulling real game simulations and randomly sampling those sims and then building lineups that are optimized for sets of simulations. Even if those other things were true, you would still only get the stacks of underdog teams at the rate at which they are optimal or are winning the game in your lineups anyway. So that's kind of, I guess, and maybe I even should have started there, but that's kind of the final, like, even if this was a factor, even if winning the game was a very correlative factor to hitting success and there were huge underdogs on the slate, I probably still wouldn't do anything specifically to target or avoid underdogs because I would know that I was getting the right amount of them in my lineups at the rate at which they were optimal anyway. So all this to say, I don't key into the percent chance, whether I'm looking at, sports betting odds or anything else. I don't really look at the percent chance of a team winning the game anyway for baseball. The other question here, which I think is also a very interesting one that we'll kind of touch on here a bit, is why don't we just play the highest projected score lineups possible? So we built this build here at the start of the stream. You can see that this is for a GPP. This was for a 150 max 10 to 50K, and our projected scores are 107.5, right? Let's build some cash lineups here real quickly, right? And we don't need very many of them. I think we could probably just get away with like 5 lineups. And let's take a look at what the projected score of these lineups looks like. And then we'll talk about what's going to happen here is the cash lineups are going to be projected for a lot more points on average than the GPP lineups. So we'll talk about why that is here in just a moment. I see we've got a lot of other people that have joined up into the stream here in the last 10 or so minutes. So welcome everybody. Happy Monday. So you can see here, yes. So projected score 123.2. So question, right? Why are we sacrificing 20 points of average projection in our GPP lineups? And the answer is that it's a multifaceted answer. But I think the where I want to start here is that average projections, players reaching their average projections in any sport isn't ultimately our goal of a GPP contest, right? Scoring a 123.2 in a typical GPP contest for tonight will probably give you nothing. You probably won't even cash, right? You get no financial reward out of that. All of the equity here in a GPP contest is at the very top 1% of the payout positions. It's not even in your favor to optimize for min cashing in GPPs because you're typically going to 2x your money or less and that's only going to happen for the top 20% of the contest. So you're basically getting a 2-to-1 odds ish on a 1 in 5 probability event of happening. It's not worth optimizing for the min cash equity. Right? You want to optimize for upside, not for average projections in GPPs because that's where the upside is. But I think the more precise answer to this is that average projections themselves and the highest average projected lineup is not itself predictive of the highest upside lineup, right? And we can actually just see that kind of clicking here. There's a few different ways to visualize this, but one of the ways we can do that is by looking at these distributions for different players, right? Another way is looking at percentiles, right? Like let's compare, the highest value bats on the slate here tonight, right? And we can see that Rowdy Tellez, right, who is a 2.92 value play on average, has a 95th percentile of 23 points. And we can look and see, let's pick some other guy here with a similar projection. Hold on. Let's look this way. Chris Bryant, who has a 9.57 points average projection, 2.28 points per dollar, has a 24.95th percentile outcome. And if we click on one of these players, right, we can see that 9.57 points is kind of almost an arbitrary descriptor of Chris Bryant's entire range of outcomes, where these are the outcomes that we actually care about. You can't, in other words, take a look at the highest average projected hitters or the best overall value plays, the point per dollar value plays, and come up with any meaningful assumption of what are the highest upside hitters on the slate, right? The percentiles, the top end percentiles are going to generally correlate, I would say, with the average projection. But the difference in between how well two players are projected on average typically is not in line with how well they are projected at their ceiling outcomes. But the other two factors that I think are kind of really missed here, if you were to just enter cash lineups into a GPP contest, are correlation and ownership, right? I'll start with ownership. A fantasy point is not an absolute value when it comes to a GPP contest, because we are not just trying to build the highest raw scoring lineup possible. We are trying to beat other lineups that are in the contest. There is a different relative value of each fantasy point scored by each player based on how many other lineups in the contest have that player. If a player that is 50% owned scores 1 point, that is 1 point shared with 50% of the rest of the field. If there is a different player that scores 1 point and is 1% owned, that is 1 fantasy point shared with only 1% of the field. And in a game where we are trying to beat the other lineups in the contest, lower owned fantasy points have more relative value. So when we look at cash lineups, for example, we see that, yes, this has 123.2 projected points, but it has 177 combined percentage points of ownership, whereas the GPP lineups we looked at, give this a second to load, have, yes, a 20% or 20 less-ish, 15 less average projected fantasy points, but have 45%-ish less combined ownership sum, right? These 107.5 fantasy points may have more relative value in a GPP than the 123 projected average points from the cash lineup we were looking at. But the final point here, and perhaps the most important one overall, is the factor of correlation, right? Even if a player's average fantasy projection was perfectly predictive of upside, it would probably still be in your interest to try to correlate your lineups here together, because it overall increases the entire percent chance of that lineup having success together, right? These are not players for playing in different games from one another, are essentially independent. They're functionally independent from each other, right? The percent chance of Dodgers hitters having good games are unaffected by the percent chance of Phillies players having good games, right? Within the same game, and particularly for baseball on the same team, that is not the case. If Ohtani is having a great game, the fact that he gets on base every single time he goes up to bat stalls off outs and makes the game longer for other Angels bats to continue to come up to the plate and get more opportunities to score. Also, if Ohtani goes on and, if three players get on base in front of Ohtani and he hits a grand slam, right? Everybody scores. All of those players are correlated together. Because we are shooting for particularly an upside outcome, it is, again, in our interest to sacrifice potentially some average projected points by playing independently correlated players and play players that have a positive correlation together, that are more likely to succeed together in the form of stacking. So ultimately, I guess to kind of sum up here, what you end up seeing is that most of the GPP lineups that you will build, good GPP lineups that you will build for baseball, are going to be projected probably quite a bit less than the cash optimal for those reasons. One, that the highest average projected player on any given slate is not very likely to be the highest overall scoring player at that position. It's pretty unlikely to happen. Two, there's relative value in lower owned fantasy points. So it is worth sacrificing some average projected points to lower the overall cumulative lineup ownership. And three, because it is to your benefit to correlate your lineup to increase the overall raw probability of reaching a high upside outcome in your lineups. So kind of a overall summary of basically why cash lineups are not viable, I guess. And then the last point that kind of ties this all together is, of course, that it is a function of the payout structure in GPPs, that all of the financial equity is at the top 1% of the contest that incentivizes you to play this way, as opposed to a cash contest where by finishing in the top half of the contest, you roughly double your money, right? There is no financial incentive to shoot for upside. So you make sense to play for the highest average projected lineup possible. So, and this is, this is going to be generally true of all sports, but I don't think there is a better example to demonstrate all three parts of this than baseball in particular. It's this high correlation sport, high variance sport, where ownership is also a very important factor, where average projections are particularly kind of unhelpful and unpredictable of upside. It's a really good sport to demonstrate this. So, hopefully that helps. And hopefully I had a good understanding of this question as well. Again, I think there were kind of two parts here. So just summarizing that first part as well before we move on, about the win probability of a team correlating with hitting performance. I think the real summary of that point in general is I don't think those two things are very well correlated. And even if they were, you would only get your underdog showing up in your GPP lineups when you built with SaberSim at the rate at which those teams won or had optimal hitting performances in the sims anyway, right? It's a really big advantage to using simulations. And that's true of a lot of things, actually. I end up giving that answer to a lot of different questions on this show when people are asking, about, I don't know, a variety of different things. You are going to only get those outcomes showing up in your lineups at the rate at which they show up in the sims, which I think is powerful. So anyway, we'll go ahead and move on here. I do see some questions showing up in YouTube chat here now as well. So YouTube gang here, just be patient with me. I have one more question that was emailed in over the weekend that we'll hit, and then a few in Slack that I'll hit from there. So good opportunity as a reminder that in general, I answer questions on the show in chronological order, but prioritizing the questions that come in from Slack first. So if you haven't already joined up our Slack community, there's a link to join in the description of every past office hours video. Highly recommend joining up, being a part of that community, talking with everybody in there and posting your questions that you have for this show in the office hours channel if you want them answered first, I guess, on the stream. But anyway, let's go ahead and move on to the next question here. This was also sent in via email. The question was basically summarized to me here as, are the differences in the choice of sliders the reason SaberSim users have drastically different results from each other? So I think in the full email, this user was asking, I saw a lot of SaberSim users at the top of contests this weekend. I was not. Why is that? Is that because SaberSim users are using different sliders from one another? And on that question in particular, for the specific what was mentioned here, the answer is probably actually no. Overall, we generally don't recommend making significant adjustments to the sliders. That is not where I think the highest value add parts of the process are. And I would say in general, for that reason, probably most SaberSim users are using approximately the sliders that are the default values for their contest. The reason why we say that overall is that we have done most of the heavy lifting for you in terms of optimizing these sliders. So these are optimized, back-tested, and data-driven sliders where we have basically built thousands of lineups at every single combination of sliders and then compared the lineups produced to actual historical past contests that ran and set the default values to where the highest actual value lineups were produced for that particular contest. So in other words, even if you could backtest over the entire last year of contests and figure out exactly where the sliders should be for your particular lineups, we have already done that and more in terms of setting these to the original default values. So you probably aren't going to see a lot of additional value get added here by adjusting the sliders. And I would probably say if you see a SaberSim logo in your contest finishing higher than you, it is probably not because that person had better sliders than you did. The default sliders, I would say, by and large, are the best values to use for your particular contest. So let's talk about what actually might happen if you do see a logo finishing higher than you. And the most likely outcome, actually, I think what's probably most commonly happening there is you're actually just probably on the unfortunate side of variance, right? This is actually, I think, a benefit to SaberSim overall. This is a significant benefit. This is a feature, really, is that we don't just build. You aren't going to get identical lineups going on to SaberSim, and by making no other changes, press build and use the lineups that you get out of them, right? If you use other lineup optimizers out there and have no randomness or anything like that and come in and press build, you will get identical lineups to anybody else doing the exact same thing. Our sim variance slider ultimately buckets simulations randomly and builds a lineup for a random bucket of our thousands of game simulations for each game on the slate. And you can actually test this out for yourself if you sat here and ran repeated builds on the exact same sliders over and over and over again, especially on a main slate with, I think it's only 7 games now because of the weather for baseball tonight. You are likely to get different lineups every single time. And there's a lot of natural variance that comes into play there, and it mimics the natural variance that exists in the game anyway. It reduces your chance of being duplicated quite a bit as well. You'll probably find overall that each build you run has a similar overall direction, right? If there are certain stacks that SaberSim likes or certain pitchers that SaberSim likes, you'll probably still be over the field on those plays. But the actual overall construction of those lineups is likely to vary quite a bit between builds. So the most likely outcome, I think, here is that if you see some SaberSim logos above you, first of all, remember there's probably plenty of them below you as well. But the difference in those lineups may just end up coming down to variance. Now, I think the elephant in the room with this question is that obviously there is a big skill ceiling and skill expression from there in DFS. It is entirely possible as well that those other players have different processes that at the very least led them to maybe better lineups on that particular slate. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are better players, but not everybody necessarily using SaberSim is going to do the exact same thing. I think we have a general paradigm of things that we recommend people to spend their time on and things that we recommend people do not spend their time on. A good example, I typically don't recommend people spend time tweaking sliders because we've done a lot of that work for you. I do very much recommend people spend time on step 3, tweaking their exposures and adjusting exposures to match up with your own personal risk tolerance or make other strategic decisions. I also generally recommend people do their own research into the slate, whatever that means to you, whether that's looking at something like Vegas or running test builds and research builds to figure out what leverage opportunities you want to play off of, adjusting team totals or ownership projections based on your research. So there are a lot of different things that you can do that are going to end up making up everybody's own individual baseball DFS process. That's going to lead you to a different direction than other people using SaberSim, especially in baseball, right? And let's look at this real quick. Let's jump over this build. In basketball, there are plays and there are teams and players and things like that I think you could probably just say are just bad plays. There are going to be players that are projected very poorly relative to their salary, and it is a normally distributed sport, so most players' most common outcomes are generally centered around their average projection. In baseball, it is a sport that plays with so much variance that you virtually any play is viable without any other context for the slate, right? I mean, you can visually see this. We have 500 lineups here for a 150 max to 10 to 50K entries, right? And on this, I think this is now a 7-game slate. We're getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Okay, so there's 8 games still on the slate here, it looks like. Every single team is at least used once in our set of 500 lineups. There's a very great deal of every play is essentially viable. So it makes it even more likely in a sport like baseball that even two people with very similar processes would end up on different plays, different stacks, even different pitchers. Whereas in NBA, I think you will find that you will probably end up on kind of a more consistent set of exposures along with other people that are playing with a very similar process to you. In NBA, for example, during the NBA season, there are typically kind of, I would say the entire SaberSim NBA community is generally celebrating on the same night. If the SaberSim model is on for that particular night, if we really kind of nailed that particular slate, generally a lot of different people are happy. Even if people do have different processes, most people don't end up on dramatically different sets of exposures and players in the player pool and things like that. Baseball is totally different. It's a very high variance sport. I could have a process that somewhat mimics yours, and my highest exposed stack might be LA, and yours might be San Diego, and I may have no San Diego, and you may have no LA, and we both kind of do a generally similar thing, and that's perfectly normal and very common in baseball. So I guess to sum up here, the answer to this question as it is written is no. I do not think it is likely that the main difference between you and SaberSim logos that are finishing above you in the contest are the choice of sliders. I think there's a great deal of variance between what lineups you're getting and what lineups that person is getting purely based on the way sim variance works alone. And then there is a full spectrum of different processes that can come into play from there. If you are looking to expand on your, actually, I just realized on my new computer, I don't have this saved here. So let me, one sec here. Let me do this and get this pulled up here. Real quick, I'm pulling up. Okay. If you are looking to build upon and expand and continue to grow your MLB DFS process, I would return to some of our content on our YouTube channel. We have quite a bit of content now here up, at least a few hours of videos to watch and listen to about how to get better at baseball DFS, about how to think about building your process out. I would watch these and research these. And you will probably find that, similar to what I've said here today, most of what is covered here is not what are the best sliders to use. It is what are the best other ways to add value. So hopefully this was helpful. Happy to kind of talk about this in more detail and dive in further if needed. But I guess one thing to mention to both of you that submitted these questions via email here, we will, well, I guess by the time you'll be watching this, you'll be watching a time-stamped recording of this stream here. So if you have follow-up questions, just email us back. But cool. Let's keep it going here. Keep it rocking. Okay. So I'm going to back up here and hit a couple questions here. And hit this question. This came in from Jeffrey over the weekend in Slack. And he said, sorry to bother you on a holiday. No big deal. Don't worry about it. And he said, entrants versus entries. I noticed SaberSim says entrants. So if there are 2,000 entries in a contest, but it's a 20 max, should I assume entrants would be 100 so or 2,000? So for your sliders, this is just the total number of lineups in the contest. This is not effective entrants as we define it in our contest selection stuff. This is literally just the total number of lineups in the contest. I know this confuses people sometimes. I apologize about that. So, you know, if you were playing the $4 20 max, for example, right? I think it has 14,000 lineups in it. These would be the correct sliders. This would be the correct drop downs. So, and then follow-up question, what contest do your projections seem to pay off the most for? Single 2150, who was playing in the $10 to $50 entry fee, 150 max entries. Okay, so a couple questions here. I wouldn't say our projections pay off more for like a single entry or a 20 max or a 150, right? Projections themselves, like average projections, aren't super useful for any contest, right? But in a larger field, 150 max, you need to optimize for a smaller or a wider range of outcomes, kind of a thinner overall margin. And that's basically what happens with the sim variance slider. So like in a single entry contest, right, we are saying like use a more average weighted projection to optimize for this contest because I don't need as much variance to take it down. And as the entry limit grows, right, people are going to play riskier. The lineup in that contest that takes it down is more likely to approach the optimal. We need to look at wider ranges of outcomes for players, smaller sets of simulations in each bucket for each lineup, which is literally what happens as sim variance increases. So the projections themselves, the projections are I don't even know what the right word is here. They don't care, or the simulations even, to be more specific. The simulations don't even care about what contests you're playing, right? The simulations are actually like DFS agnostic, right? They don't even care about necessarily that there's like a DFS component to this. There's a baseball simulation. The sport of baseball is being simulated here. Then we've optimized how many simulations to look at to optimally play the game of DFS, right? So the projections themselves, the simulations are not optimized for a particular contest type. And then another question here, who was playing in the $10 to $15 entry fee, 150 max entries? Is it all pros? I steer clear of those because that's my assumption. The contests I play most are single entry with big pot and modest entry fee, $1 to $20, a lot of contestants, and the other is 20 max low entry fee and a lot of contestants. So it sounds like you have the right ideas with your contest selection principles. I'd return to this video here. If you have more questions about contest selection in general, this will kind of break it down in a little bit more detail. I think, again, single entry and 20 max with a lot of effective entrants, I think, are great contests to target. The $15 or the $10 to $15, the flagship GPP, as it's typically called here, is definitely not filled with all pros. In fact, I think it's probably the softest overall 150 max contest on DraftKings most nights. If you were to, one way to calculate that, one way to basically try to estimate the sharpness of a contest that has flaws, but I think is a decent assumption, is calculate the overall percentage of lineups in the contest made by people maxing it out. You are making an assumption that anybody maxing a contest out is sharper, but I think that's a decent assumption. The $15, the $18, the $20, whatever it is on a given night will have a lower percentage of 150 maxers in it than even the 50 cent or $1 mini max, sometimes significantly so. And some of that's a price point thing, right? There are less overall players that can overall afford to max that contest out. So the equity taken up in that contest by 150 maxers is a lot smaller. Now, that's not a contest I would immediately go in and rush to enter for a few reasons. One, it has a very top-heavy payout structure. It is you will need to take that contest down if you are going to play it over the long term to be profitable playing that contest. And there's so much financial equity in first place that your variance, your swings of playing that contest over the long term are going to be very dramatic. Second, and probably the more important reason, is that, you know, even if you have $150, right, to play on a particular slate, your $150 can go a lot further and play a lot more unique lineups into lower dollar fee contests first, as opposed to just playing 10 lineups in the $15. So I would recommend, while that contest in theory can plays somewhat soft, I don't want to necessarily say it plays soft. It plays probably softer than the mini maxes do, at least in my opinion. It's not a contest I would jump to go ahead and start entering before you've played a lot of the other greater contests in the lobby. And if you want a contest selection refresher, I'd come back to this video. 4 simple rules to build your MLB DFS bankroll. I created a kind of nifty little spreadsheet as well and linked it in the description of this video that you can use and take advantage of to optimize your contest selection strategies. So, okay, cool. Let's keep it going here. I'm feeling particularly, I don't know, rambly here today. Hopefully not coming across that way to you guys, but we've got a lot of questions still here to get through. So maybe we try to pick up the pace a little bit here. But anyway, let's go ahead and get to this one. This one is from Wayne. He said, is there a way to individually select lineups from a pool of 150 and load them to a CSV file? Seems like you should be able to deselect all and add the ones you want. Please advise. Yes, you certainly can. Easiest way to do that is to just go into the build. So you'll go into a build of lineups that you have here, set the number of lineups to 1. And then what you can do is just go into, so you can actually even from here deselect that 1 and then go into your pool. And if you preferred, you could just literally click in all of your 150s this way, right? So you could say, I like this lineup, and I like this lineup, and I like this lineup, and this one. And certainly a pretty long way to end up with 150, but if you wanted to, you could do it that way. I think I like this approach quite a bit when I'm only playing a few lineups. I'll maybe if I'm playing 10 or less lineups, I kind of like to go in and handpick them this way. But assuming that maybe I just wanted 5, right? Maybe not 150, but assuming these are the 5 I wanted to play, I could save them here as a new lineup set and then use the entry editor to get them into my contests. Or if you just want a lineups file here, like you described, if you download this, this will download the lineups file of those 5 lineups to your computer. So, okay. And then a couple questions from Average Call of Duty player here. That name always cracks me up. I'm sure you're better than average, buddy. I bet. All right. Anyway, cool. Question says, so I have a question about creating a player pool. MLB is the only way to create a player pool of players I like to manage the exposures after the lines have been created. So, for example, if I like Jock Peterson, the optimizer doesn't put him in any of my lines. The only way to get him is to go and change his minimum exposure, I'm assuming. So I assume I would have to do that for all players I like. Any chance of adding a like button in the future? Okay, so no, there's adjusting player exposures in step 3 is not the only way to curate your player pool. I think it's the safest way to curate your player pool. And the reason why I think that is because the lineups that you are getting here, let's just re-expand this up to 20, right? The lineups that you're going to be getting in this set here are optimized with the default projections and default sliders for this particular slate, right? So you have a pool of 500 lineups that you kind of already know are viable here. So if you want to go in and, bump your exposure to Jock Peterson, maybe we want 15% exposure to Jock Peterson, right? Well, okay, here's a good example. I guess the point I'm making here is that you can do so in a way that pulls from a pool of lineups that has already been optimized for your contest. Now, if you do this for a lot of different players, or you do this for a particular player that the builder is not very high on, the sims are not very high on, you may get this message that says, we need to expand the lineup pool in order to match your exposures. Continue building. What this is saying is that there are not 20 lineups in our pool of 500 where at least 15% of the lineups have Jock Peterson in it, right? Generally a pretty good flag here to go back to step one and make some adjustments there. So we're not going to add a like button, I don't think. Instead of a like button, I would recommend bumping your projections by 10%. You can do that at the team total level, or you can do that at the player level, right? So if you literally do like Jock Peterson and Jock Peterson alone, I would say bumping him, 10% is a good starting point, maybe a full point at least here. I know that's a little bit more than 10%, right? Will definitely, that is basically the effect. If you've used a like button at other optimizers before, that's basically what it's doing. It's giving some flat percentage point bump to that player in the projections behind the scenes. So I would just recommend doing that. For baseball, I really like using these team totals. So for me personally, it's difficult to think of a situation where I would literally uniquely like Jock Peterson and Jock Peterson alone. I think it would be more likely that I like giant stacks. So the way I would approach this is bump up their team projection by about a half run. I like to do team total adjustments by about half run to full run intervals, and then run another build and see what you get there. So I think, reviewing this question here again, right? What I would probably do is, if you have this understanding of what players you like and dislike on the slate, I would make adjustments. I would first run a build with default settings and default projections and see what you can get away with in step 3. But if you're finding that the builder can't find lineups that have the exposures to different players that you want, I would come back to step 1 and make team total adjustments. So, and I would on teams where you like certain hitters, I would bump their team total adjustment down. On teams where you like certain pitchers, I would either bump the opposing team total down, or if you just don't like that team on a hitting basis, right, I would bump that team down. If you do have certain situations, if you're like, no, Jordan, I literally do like, I just think Jock Peterson is underprojected, then I'd bump his projection alone. But that's the way I would probably end up going about that. Is I would see what you can do. I would run a test build first, see what you can do on step 3 with a test build, and then come back to step 1 and make player projection adjustments here, based on what you're getting out of that test build. So, yeah. But the like button, the main reason why we don't want to add that is I think it overly simplifies things. And we don't want to create, I also think it's a little bit of a black box, where I've seen that elsewhere, but it's not entirely clear what that does. It's just kind of like, give me more of this guy. And I think there are just more quantitative and explicit ways to just get the exposure to these guys that you want. The alternative, the one other thing I didn't mention, right, is you could also just come in here and just say, give me 20% Jock Peterson, right? That's another option. And I think setting minimum exposures or bumping player projections or things like that is just a more precise and surgical way of getting your lineups the way you want, as opposed to kind of a black boxy like button. So, okay, great. I see a couple other questions in Slack. For now, I'm going to jump over to YouTube chat and catch up for everybody that has been patiently waiting in YouTube chat here. Let's get this going here. So Justin had asked, why does the lineup builder base its calculations on a subset of simulated lineups rather than the data from all of them? Apologies if I misunderstood how it works. No, you do understand how it works. So if we were to use every simulation for every single lineup, right, we would basically just be optimizing for the average projection, right? That would basically, you would be getting lineups optimized to perform the highest on average. But as we discussed here at the start of the stream, the lineups that are the highest expected average performing are not the highest expected value lineups. They are not the most profitable for a variety of reasons, but in a summary, because average projections are not predictive of upside. The highest average projected lineup possible does not necessarily, even just in a vacuum, necessarily mean that it is the highest upside lineup possible. But also, it does not account for things like correlation, right? And it does not account for ownership, right? The optimal cash lineup is not going to be the most highest expected value lineup possible that you could play into GPPs, right? And even we can even think about this on an individual player level, right? Bryce Harper is the highest average projected batter on the slate at the moment. He's playing in Coors. He's as an average projection of 12 points, right? Even his most common outcome is less than 5 points, right? The percent chance that he is the highest scoring player on the slate is very low. It may, I'm not positive about this. It may be still true that he has the highest percent chance to be the highest scoring individual batter on the slate, but the raw probability of that happening itself is just not a very likely outcome. There's very little financial benefit to optimizing for the highest average projection lineup possible in a GPP. And the larger that GPP gets, the more the winning lineup in that contest is likely to approach the actual highest scoring optimal at the end of the night. And the more financial incentive there is to being at the top of that contest in the form of the payout structure, the less you want to play the highest projected average lineup possible. So that is why when we optimize your lineups, your GPP lineups with SaberSim, among other things, we'll use a subset of the total simulations as opposed to all of them. And let me know if that helps, because that's a very crucial point to grasp. So if I'm doing a poor job of explaining that, or you're still have other follow-up questions, please let me know, because I think it's a very important point. AK Knowledge said, I noticed for MMA that there's not a main card captain sim available. Is this in the works at all? You're talking about like there's another contest type, right? It is in the works. I think it's on our radar because it's a different like lineup construction and slate type. It's something that we kind of have to do. It's not, I guess what I'm saying, it's not trivial to just add it. But it is on our radar to add. So yes. Dante said, on a slate like tonight, how many pitchers are you typically keeping in your pool? Is it a mistake for me to trust the Sims and not touch my pitcher pool at all in step one? It is certainly not a mistake. I typically do very little adjustments to a pitching pool let's start with a fresh build here. Because I've used this build for a lot here. I virtually never make adjustments to my player pool in step one, particularly for MLB. Occasionally for other sports, but especially for MLB. I will make adjustments to my pitching pool on step three. There have been a couple slates here over the past few days. I think with Coors in particular. Over the weekend, I was getting a lot of Coors pitchers. And they weren't particularly good pitchers. Tonight, I'd be more interested in a guy like Aaron Nola, who's a talented pitcher. And even in a really heavy hitting ballpark like Coors, I'd be interested in his upside there. I wasn't very interested in playing like Justin Steele and Senzatella and like these guys that just aren't very good pitchers. And I was getting a little bit of exposure to them. I get it, especially if you're already fading Coors as a hitting stack, which I was. I get the idea of having a little bit of exposure to the pitchers. I just wasn't very excited to do it. So I don't do a lot of I haven't been doing a lot of player pool curation on my pitchers in step one, but I do like the idea of reviewing my pitchers in step three and making some adjustments here. Personally, just basically what I've been doing is I've just been cautious about, and I don't even know. I think I'm not sure if it's I've seen Brubaker or Brubaker. I don't know how it's pronounced in some places. And I've seen Zach Thompson and others. I don't know who's actually pitching for the Pirates yet tonight. But this is the kind of guy that like, even in a larger field 20 max, I don't know if I need to get this different for me. I have generally been crossing off some of these very low projected pitchers. Same thing here, right? I think I can get different enough without playing a guy like Chad Kuhl against the Phillies in Coors. Yanoa's interesting. I think maybe this stuff too is like, I'm kind of just kicking some of this from my head with kind of my intuitive thoughts on these pitchers. I would probably maybe do a little bit more research before crossing these guys off. I think Yanoa has at least a little bit more upside. I'm not sure against the Dodgers, but at least he's shown a little bit more strikeout upside before. I might leave him in my pool. But for now, for the purposes of this, I would, if I had to make a decision right now, I'd probably cross him off. And there's generally just enough diversity with the different stacks you can play, and even enough good pitching options of just better overall pitchers that a lot of times I don't feel like I need to get all the way down to the bottom of the barrel with my pitchers and play those guys. So all of this to say, though, like because we're building such a big pool of lineups here in step 3, I feel the need to do a lot of this in step 1. And in fact, I kind of want SaberSim to tell me like, hey, maybe you should at least consider playing some Coors pitchers here before just waving them off completely. Like I want to know that Zach Thompson was showing up at 15% of my lineups if I didn't touch anything. Maybe there's an opportunity. Maybe I'm missing something there. Maybe there's something interesting there. So I don't like to do as much of that up in step 1, especially with how diverse the pool gets in step 3 anyway. I don't feel like I have to. But I have been doing a little bit of kind of just eyeball testing my pitchers and making sure that I want to play these guys, right? And I want to be invested in them. Like I like to think about some of these guys as they're like financial assets, right? Like if I'm playing, if I'm playing $100, right? $1 a lineup, 100 lineups, right? I'm going to play 15% Zach Thompson, just an example. Like, I think that helps for me to think about that way. Like, am I interested in staking into that asset at 15%? And I probably wouldn't with how many other options there are. But sometimes you can kind of experiment with this. Like, maybe, I don't know, maybe you get off of some of those pitchers and you end up on like a bunch of really junky stacks because the only way to get different on the slate was to play really cheap pitchers or something like that, or pricing super efficient. And your lineups like look worse as a result of that. But I definitely recommend looking at that. So Brad said, I've had a really rough run in every sport for the last 3 weeks or so. It's super discouraging, and I'm beginning to wonder if I'm not doing too much, not enough, just at a loss. Yeah, look, downswings can be really brutal, like even mentally. I've been through them. I was swinging down a bit, I guess, up until this past weekend, and I had a pretty decent weekend overall. One thing I would remember too is that, like, even just a 24-hour break sometimes, if you're a daily grinder, sometimes a day break can be pretty nice, can be pretty resetting. Even just a single day, sometimes a week off can be pretty nice, just as a mental break. I will say a 3-week downswing, even a significant 3-week downswing, to be completely transparent, is nothing. It can get worse than that, and they can go longer than that. That is why we preach bankroll management and contest selection as often as we do. But you will have worse downswings than that. So I think there's also a merit to doing things that I often end up doing in my downswings is checking on my top 1% equity, which is a method of determining your lineup quality that has its flaws, but I think is a decent way to just make sure you're on the right track. I think that can be a good thing, to go in and check on and see, not even just over that 3-week sample necessarily, but just in your baseball history or other sports history, and make sure that things are on the right track. But the variance of the game is high enough that a 3-week downswing is not to say that, like, I don't know, feeling discouraged is not valid, because it absolutely is. But it can get worse than 3 weeks. And I think if you're feeling that on your mental well-being, take a couple days. I highly recommend that. I'm going out of town here towards the end of this week. Friday, I'll be gone Friday to Tuesday. And I've played DFS while traveling before to mixed results. I'm probably going to use this as an opportunity to just take a little bit of a mental reset anyway, because I think it's healthy. I think it's good. So, Shady said, downswings happen to everyone. I'm on a 1+ month one. If you have time, that's done. I talked candidly on the High Stakes podcast last week about a 10-month one he went on in 2021. Yeah, they can get worse. And I think there's almost all high stakes players and all DFS players have their own individual stories of their worst downswings. But I know Brick75 was on the same podcast and has a pretty interesting story about a six-figure downswing as well. So, okay, cool. Max, I hope you're still here, man. I want to build my first MLB slate with SaberSim tonight. How do you recommend a first-time user? So for your very first builds with SaberSim, there's obviously a lot going on here, but I would say the most valuable things that you can do on your first night of building baseball lineups with SaberSim, first of all, especially on a night like tonight, is check the weather. The Giants, Mets, and the Rays Cubs game both have some pretty significant weather concerns. So if it were locking right now, I would exclude these games because I think the weather is bad enough that they make me nervous. I would keep an eye on the news. That is one thing. SaberSim will automate and make a lot easier for you most of the steps of the process here. It will not fade games that have postponement risk. We take weather into account in our models, in our simulations and predictions, but we will not fade games with a risk of postponement. So I would probably fade those two if it was lock right now. From there, I would start your build and I would select your drop downs here, right? Select these drop downs. So actually, when you pull this up, it'll look like this. You won't even see the sliders. If you click manual mode, you will. I would build your lineups appropriately for the contest that you are targeting, right? And what we will do is we will optimize the way that we are taking into account correlation and ownership and variance in a way that is optimized for your contest you are playing. So if you are used to other tools, you are probably very used to having to set stacking rules to take into account correlation. You may have set ownership cap limits or rules like must include 2 players under 5% ownership or something like that to take into account ownership. You probably have set randomness or minimum and maximum exposures before the build to take into account variance. Those are the things that on SaberSim you do not need to worry about. Those are the things that are generally handled for you here. So step 2 is kind of a lower value part of the process. I wouldn't worry too much about this particular step. Tell us what contest you are playing. When then it comes time to build your final lineups here, you will go to step 3. Step 3 for a new user, and even for a more intermediate or advanced user, I think is the highest value part of the process to spend your time. You'll see this. We are building this for a 20 max contest. We are not just building 20 lineups. We are building 500 lineups. And the point of that is so that 1, we have a better shot at identifying what the best 20 are to actually use. But 2, so that you can edit things here on step 3 and pick what kind of lineups you want to end up playing with without having to go back and build. So I would use step 3 as an opportunity to, 1, lower your exposure to different players to manage your risk tolerance based on how much exposure you want to certain players. But 2, also to make some strategic decisions. Because you are not spending time setting stacking rules and having to go through the motions of doing all the programming, the optimizer that you have to do on Fantasy Cruncher and other tools that are out there, you get to spend more time on the fun stuff of like strategizing and figuring out how you want to approach the slate. So a couple things that I typically want to do, what this looks like for me, I will typically check on my stack types and just make sure that the stacks look good. They look pretty good to me. Again, didn't have to set any stacking rules here, and we're getting 5-3, 5-2, 4-4, 4-3. Those look pretty good to me. I'm pretty happy with that. I'll typically check my pitcher pool and just make sure that I'm getting exposure to pitchers that I want. Interesting pitching slate here tonight. I think it's kind of an ugly slate, actually. I like highest overall projected pitcher. Actually, Manea, I think is a decent play overall, but you look at these high salary guys, Kershaw against the Braves. I don't like playing anybody against the Braves. Montas hasn't really looked super great so far this season, I don't think. Kind of an ugly pitching slate, but overall in general, I still probably this is getting into my strategy. This doesn't have to say anything about yours, but I guess long story short, I've been crossing off a lot of these very low projected pitchers here when I get to step 3. I like to see them. I mentioned this before. I like to see if I'm getting some exposure here, but I may not want to play some of those guys. Even a guy like Spencer Watkins, right? Projected for under 10 average points at pitching, I might not be very interested. And I'm also I like to manage my risk with my hitters overall. Even a guy like Ohtani, obviously a great hitter, can break the slate very easily with one swing of the bat. We click in here. His most common outcome is 0 points, happens 22% of the time. I would not want to be 90% invested into a guy like that, even though SaberSim kind of says that this is the optimal strategy for this contest. I'm probably going to avoid being more than 40% exposed to any one batter. If you have strategic decisions that you want to make here in step 3 as well. So first of all, I should clarify what I'm doing here. I'm setting maximum exposures of 40% to these different batters. So what that's doing is that's going through the pool of 500 to find the best 20 where no more than 40%, where no more than 40% of those 20 lineups have these guys in them, right? So, and then I'll kind of I'll do a little bit of an iterative process. I'll make sure that I still like the stacks types after I adjust something. I'll kind of make sure that I still like the way things are coming out here. Lorenzen actually, I think, is a little more interesting, has shown a little bit of strikeout upside this season so far. I might actually, I think one of the plays I'm a little more interested in this particular slate is Aaron Nola. I might strategically bump him up a little bit. Okay, so this is a good example here. We're getting now an error that says we need to expand the lineup pool in order to match your exposures, continue building. This to me is generally a good flag that I've done too much, right? At this point, there aren't 20 lineups in my pool of 500 that match everything I was trying to do. So I'll probably just remove that and just be satisfied with the little bit of Nola I was getting already. But that's kind of what I do. And that's kind of what I recommend you do for your first builds here is don't worry too much about adjusting things in step 1. Don't worry too much about adjusting things in step 2. Spend your time in step 3 and work in this kind of viable set of lineups that you have here and have fun with it. So let me know if that helps. Cool. AK had said, I would think that the like button is the lock button at this point. Maybe. That's kind of the part of the problem with the like button, right? And that's kind of why we want to avoid it, is that like you have a different assumption of what you think it is than I do. In my mind, I think a like is more like a kind of a soft bump up. But that's kind of the problem with a like button. We would just rather people have the explicit ability and push people in the direction of explicitly changing a projection or a minimum exposure so they get the impact that they expect to get. So, Max had also said, or videos to watch on SaberSim MLB or anything to get started. We do have some good MLB videos here. Variety of different streams that I've done over the past 2 weeks or so here. I would go check these out if you want a little bit more background on our tools here, but hopefully that was kind of a good, decent introduction here. So. All right. I see some interesting conversation here going on in chat about just downswings in general. It is definitely a part of the game here. I'm going to continue to kind of see if I can find another question here. Jared said, in single entry, is the approach build a cash type lineup with a gap pivot at lower ownership, or is there a stack that seems to shine in single entry? I think in single entry, it is true that you do not need to be as aggressive with the way that you fade the chalk. I don't think you don't need to be as aggressive with the way that you fade the chalk as you might in a 150 max. You also probably don't need to play as high of a variance strategy overall, but I don't think I wouldn't call it a cash type lineup because it is still very, very important to build a highly correlated lineup. In cash, you're often going to have hitters from a variety of different teams. I would say in a single entry, you still want a big overall stack. You just may be stacking one of the best overall projected teams on the slate. And you can go see, I think one of the best ways, the other factor here is that ultimately strategy for a different contest type is slate dependent. On a slate where there is elite pitching, maybe the way that you build a profitable single entry GPP lineup is to play the chalky elite pitchers and get a more unique stack. It will vary slate to slate. So, one thing I like to do is I just like to go pick the contest type that you're building for. So maybe it's, a 5,000 person single entry, and I'll build a few extra lineups. Maybe I'll build 10. Maybe I don't need 500 lineups behind that, and go see what the slate looks like. Right. One of the big valuable parts of SaberSim is that because because we're using these sims to build lineups and we have an understanding of the optimal strategy for different contest types, you don't have to come up with all the answers for yourself before starting your process. You can use SaberSim as an advisor and see what are the optimal strategies on this particular slate? What are some different ways I can go? And then do your own research or kind of, add in a little bit of that and kind of decide how you want to approach the slate. But SaberSim is not just going to be a dumb spreadsheet that builds just random cash lineups for you. It kind of, it understands upside, right? So, I mean, you can kind of even see it here. So 1,000 to 10,000 single entry, right? SaberSim is basically telling you look, you've basically got two options at pitcher, right? You're basically playing Montes and Manea. So great. And then we look at the team stacks. Actually, it basically says, realistically, you're basically playing these two. You're playing a LA and Houston stack with Manea and Montes. If we expand this, right, we'll see probably some more diversity start to come in. Right. So we actually can see, if we look at the first 100 lineups, or even rather than the first 100, let's look at the first 50, right? You can see other stacks start to show up. It's actually, Philly has some potential here as well. Cincy, Coors game overall, right? You see some other games start to pop up here a little bit, but this will kind of point you in the direction on a slate specific basis of the way to build a single entry lineup. So Don said, in MLB, does altering projections have any value, or does it make sense to alter exposures? I think altering projections can have a ton of value. My favorite way to go about doing it is to alter the team projections, because then what you get is you get a correlated, a correlated adjustment, right? Let's say, personally, let's say you like the Braves. I think the Braves are a little bit interesting tonight here. Again, this is kind of intuitive. I haven't done a ton of research on this particular slate yet, but Kershaw had a very high profile, good game the last time he was on the mound. I suspect that the Braves are going to be pretty low owned tonight. And that could come in the form of me. The way I approach that could come in the form of me being yeah, I'm high on Olsen and Riley and Ozuna or something like that. But when I think about baseball strategy overall, I think about things more on the stack side. So what I probably want to do is probably adjust this team up by maybe about a half run to get a little bit more exposure to them in step 3, right? But the reason why I like to do that is because you get this correlated effect where it appropriately adjusts all the hitters on that team, but it also is going to have a generally very minor effect on the opposing team batters. But most importantly, that's also going to act as a bit of a fade of Kershaw because his projection is going to go down. So I like making adjustments to team totals. I highly recommend doing it. But I think the team totals is a better approach than individual players. That is only if that is the way that you want to approach things. Adjusting projections is not necessarily inherently better than adjusting exposures. An alternative way to do this would be to set a minimum exposure to Braves or to just bump up your minimum exposure in step 3. Different ways to skin a cat, really. I don't think one is inherently better than the other. But if you're going to adjust projections for baseball in particular, I love the idea of doing it on the team totals way, because I really like those correlated adjustments. And I don't if I'm high on the Braves, I don't really want to have to think about how much should I bump, Dansby Swanson, who's batting 9th or projected to hit bat 9th versus Austin Riley, who's batting 3rd, right? I'm high on the whole team, but I don't know. That automates that for you. So Jonathan said, hey, Jordan, question regarding NBA. Do you think that playing slates where there aren't likely going to be many late swap opportunities to be not so profitable? In potentially. And okay. If you are basically just doing if you are making no other changes to your lineup construction overall, or no other changes to your process overall, yes, a slate where there's going to be less late swap opportunities is probably theoretically less profitable. However, I think you can find an edge elsewhere. So one thing that I've been doing in the NBA playoffs so far here is I have been I have been doing more research builds and trying to play more exploitatively and finding ownership inefficiencies because I don't think there are as many late swap opportunities, and I think it's less likely that the slate changes context very dramatically and suddenly on me. So I guess it's kind of two sides, right? On one hand, like because I'm less worried about a significant late swap changing the way ownership lies on the slate, I think it's easier to spend time on that. But two, also to kind of build back up that edge that I lose from having inefficient late swap in the field. I've been kind of adding that back in. That's just one option, really, too. I think if you're playing NBA, I think if you're playing playoff DFS for NBA, I think there's kind of really there's really a couple ways to get an edge. I think that's one, is to really key into ownership, spend some time studying the ownership, make sure that you're satisfied with the ownership projections as they are, and then really, whether you're doing a research build or some other process, figure out how to exploit the field for inefficient ownership. The other, I think, is to dive into the kind of detailed projections and projections overall and the implied rotations of a team and make adjustments there, especially as we go on, as these series continue to go on too. There's kind of an interesting game that opens up of the way that a coach, like if the Nuggets go down 0-2 tonight, I would expect to see them do something different heading into game 3. And we might get a hint of what that might be based on following beat reporters. We might not. After game 3, there's probably maybe something's going to be different. Maybe there won't. Then there's an interesting game of game 4, right? Like maybe they win game 3. Then what does game 4 look like? Do the Warriors answer? Like you get this interesting chess game back and forth. I think if you're staying really plugged into the series and like even I'm not a big like watch the games guy, but I do think in playoffs, if you're kind of watching the games and following along and studying the rotations, I think there's value to that. All of that said, that's just not the way that I like to approach DFS. That's not the way that I play the game. So I've adjusted here to playing a more ownership exploitative style for the playoffs. Personally, but yes, broadly speaking, that's what I would recommend. So, said haven't had much success in the playoff games. SaberSim has been mainly suggesting to play the chalk fields, how to get an advantage over the field. Oh, it's hard to get an advantage over the field. Yeah, I mean the one thing too is like again, it's harder in basketball to fade the chalk because the chalk is going to be projected very well, right? Like if we look at Achua, right? So almost 7x value, right? Probably the best value play we've had in the playoffs so far. 4,300 is going to score 24 points. That's like 6x value, 75% of the time, right? Difficult chalk to fade. Not a very easy fade. In baseball, way easier to fade the chalk because the ranges of outcomes are so much wider. Yeah, I think it can be a little bit harder. I think the most interesting chalk to fade in basketball is the expensive chalk, right? A lot of these guys at the top at the salary range here are going to have, even if our percentiles imply that there's a bigger difference here, right? The reality is here, a lot of these guys, I guess Jokic and Embiid are kind of in a class of their own. A lot of these guys here are going to have a pretty similar upside percentage projection, right? Like realistically, right? So if you are getting an ownership discount on one of these guys, I think it's an interesting guy to get on over the field on. So, I apologize that looks like there's been some freezes here on stream today. I don't know what's going on there. Maybe an internet issue for me. I'll check on that. Maybe I need a router restart or something after today, but Max said, great tips. Thank you so much for the help. Played daily fantasy for a long time, but wanted to try this out. Yeah, welcome. I do this stream every Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern. So I will be right back here again tomorrow. If you experiment tonight, play around with it, and have questions, I'll be right back here on stream again tomorrow. So Kevin said, can you go over uniques and how it changes things? Yeah, so the uniques, the min uniques here is basically the number of players that must be different when comparing any two lineups to each other in the pool. So by default, this is set at 1. And that means that any two lineups in the pool must have a single player different, right? No duplicates, right? Well, you can increase this, and that will kind of increase how different two lineups must be when comparing each other. So if this is 2, right, every lineup must have 2 players different when comparing each other to the pool. I describe it a lot on stream as a blunt force way of forcing diversity into your lineups. The reason I call it a blunt force object is because it's a restriction on the builder. It is like a requirement of the way that the builder builds lineups to follow the rule. I think it's probably easiest seen like contrasted to sim variance. So I think the best way to increase your diversity in your lineups overall is to increase your sim variance slider. And what this does is it means we'll use a smaller set of simulations as we build each lineup in your pool. All the way up to 10. 10 is a single game simulation. Every lineup will be a single game simulation. It will be an optimal, essentially, for a single game simulation of our set of sims. By increasing the number of simulation or decreasing the number of simulations used for each individual lineup, you naturally increase the diversity, but in a way that relies on real ranges of outcomes and real simulations for the game. And it's a much more natural way of increasing the diversity. So all this to say, I would, if you want more diversity in your lineups, I would start by increasing the sim variance slider. To me, the best reason to increase the min uniques ever is if you already have a sim variance at 10 and you're looking at your pool and you want more diversity from there. That's when I think it's a good opportunity to increase the min uniques. From there, I would start slow. I think 2 is a good start, and then go up to 3. I've never heard a situation where somebody had a pool of lineups built sim variance 10 and min uniques 3 and wanted even more diversity. I think at that point it's a little bit overkill, but that's kind of an introduction there. So Jonathan said, isn't it just better to make 1,500 lineups instead of 500? Probably. Yes, I typically do. There is in NBA, it's like almost really no build time difference. In baseball, there is a difference in build time. You will probably feel a difference in the amount of time it takes to build 500 versus 1,500 lineups. So that said, you're often not right up against the clock in baseball. We typically get starting lineups out early enough that you can kind of get things in and afford to wait longer. I would say broadly speaking, yes, it's probably better to build 1,500 lineups. But I don't know how much of a big factor that is. If you're not making very many adjustments either in step 3, I'm not sure. There's some break-even point where it's not worth building additional lineups, and I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. CS Harrell said, in MLB, using default slider settings on 20 or 150 entry builds, the top lineups are almost always single game stacks. Pitchers from other games with batters are very often from a single game. Is this effect intentional? I've been hearing that a lot lately. It's not, let's see. So we do have this like kind of generally soft correlation here between these opposing team batters. It's not intentional by any means. I think it's picking up on a very light correlation between opposing teams. The one thing to remember here too is that like the two teams playing in the same park generally are going to be like only very minorly positively correlated at all, if at all. But there are generally some park factors or overall weather. If like a game is a good sabermetric environment for scoring, it can create a lot of positive game stacks overall. I would say for me personally, game stacks are not something that I'm particularly trying to avoid or target. If I get them, great. If I don't, great. So there is, yeah, I have noticed a lot of them recently as well for me. I'm generally not trying to avoid or target them. I wouldn't say it is an intentional thing that is like programmed in as something that we specifically want to target. I I think it's probably just kind of randomness that is why you're getting them. I know at the start of the season we did I think we were over projecting the correlation between opposing teams, and we've made an adjustment there. There were more game stacks coming in at the very first week of the season. That's since been toned down a little bit. I know this LA and Houston game in particular we are kind of in love with here tonight. I think it's a little bit of the way that the slate presents. This is a game. I'm curious where Vegas has this game. Let's see. One sec. I suspect that on the slate tonight that you're seeing it more because, let's see. Yeah, I don't know. My hypothesis was that our simulations were far over on this game, but they're not. We are almost exactly in line with Vegas. I'm thinking maybe on tonight, probably what is actually happening here is that we have a Coors game on the slate, which obviously both teams are playing in a great hitting park. So game stacks of that game are going to work out very well. And then maybe that this is a game that we just have well projected and relatively low owned, so that with a high ownership fade, it's promoting a lot of game stacks of this game. Those are the stacks that it seemed like were really mostly coming up. I was going to look here one more thing before I kind of move on. Interesting. Yeah, one thing that seems weird, and I'll follow up. I'll follow up with the rest of the team on this, because one thing I'm noticing here is that it seems like in particular for this game that our opposing team correlations are a lot higher, and I'm not sure exactly why that is. So, like wait, let me go back to this. Oh, actually, no, they're really not. They're about in line with the other teams. So disregard that last point. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably what it is. I think this is probably a game that just is that we think is a good hitting environment that is pretty low owned. So both teams are popping a lot. And then we obviously have the Coors Field game on the slate where both teams are going to be in a good hitting environment. Also, not a lot of other great, hitting environments overall, right? I mean, if we literally just look at just the team projections, we have the two best teams overall on the slate are against each other. The third best team, the third best overall team is playing in this game as well. So kind of a little rambly here on this last one here. But anyway. All right, cool. I'm going to hit these questions here in the Office Hours channel in Slack. And then we'll begin to wrap up here. This was from Phantom. He said there was a question in the MLB channel asking about the viability of backtesting prior slates, or if it's not worth it due to sim variance. I would approach with caution with backtesting in any way that is like going into a past slate on SaberSim and trying to optimize that build to get the highest actual scoring lineup as possible. The reason why is because on a single slate sample, or even on a 30 slate sample, right? Full season sample, right? Like actually maybe at a full season sample, you start to have something meaningful. The point I'm trying to make is that all you will have done really is probably figured out some arbitrary set of steps or settings to optimize for a slate that already took place. There's obviously more rigorous, programmatic backtesting that you can do of a process where you are like simulating results or something like that. That is far more complicated and probably not something you would do in the SaberSim app. But I don't know what meaningful lessons you could learn from, for example, going back to yesterday's slate and playing around with it for hours until you built the highest average projected lineup possible. I don't know what you would learn from that. The random kind of button presses and things you might do Like ultimately, if you really wanted to optimize for yesterday's slate, the best thing you could do is download the actual scores and re-upload them as projections and then build lineups, right? Obviously, that wouldn't be very useful. So figuring out exactly what teams to include in your stacking rule, like figuring out how to back into that also wouldn't be very useful. What I do think is a good idea is spending time thinking about your process and asking yourself, what parts of my process add value? How long does it take me to do that? How good am I at doing that? And is there somebody that does this, if this doesn't add value at all, maybe just remove it? Or is there something I could outsource and figure out a better way to do it that way, right? Like a good, very common example is like, and I don't think anybody actually does this, I hope not, but you don't need to spend time following every MLB beat writer to get the starting lineups from every team, right? You are essentially outsourcing the confirmed starting lineups to SaberSim, but also maybe outsourcing your MLB news aggregation to Fantasy Labs MLB or Underdog MLB or something like that, right? I outsource my weather research to Kevin Roth at Roto Grinders, essentially, because I use his tools to determine how I want to approach weather on that particular slate, right? So, and those are just research ideas, but I would say spending time, instead of trying to backtest and optimize for a past slate that already ran, backtest your process in a kind of by viewing it in a critical lens and asking yourself, are these steps I'm taking to build lineups every night helpful? Are they adding value? Could I make them more time efficient, or could I make them more accurate, etc.? I think that's a better use of your time. So, but all right. And then one question here from Marcus. And he said, when it comes to MLB Showdown, what should I set the minimum projection to? In general, for wow, there's a lot of weather games on the Showdown slate tonight. For all sport types, if I'm playing a Showdown contest, I always just want this to be 0. Include players with my projection is greater than 0. If a player has any point projection at all, I typically want to include them in my player pool for Showdowns, because since we are building most Showdown lineups on sim variance, well, actually, interesting. Yeah, there we go. Showdown lineups are often, Showdown contests are often sim variance 10, which means you're using a single sim optimal. So you are only going to get players in your lineups at the rate at which they are optimal in your lineups, which means that in general, like I want a player that has a 1-point projection showing up in my player pool, because I want to get them into my lineups at the rate at which they're optimal, right? That I want that exposure there. With that said, in baseball in particular, the one thing to pay attention to is your relief pitchers. I think if you're getting relief pitchers in your lineups, it is worth doing a quick check to see if they pitched recently. And if they pitched recently, like for me, generally, I like this this site, baseballpress.com, bullpen usage. Typically for me, if they pitched the day before, I will just X them. I will just cross them out. Otherwise, I'm fine playing them. And I want them in my lineups because they play and they have, these relief pitchers have an actual range of outcomes. So I typically want them in my lineups. But okay, cool. I don't see any other questions coming in here. We'll go ahead and leave it there for today's stream. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, asking questions, participating. I see some interesting questions or interesting conversation going on in chat alongside the stream here, which I always like. Always cool to see that. Before we go ahead and wrap up here for today's stream, I will mention one more time to join the Slack community if you haven't already. Again, you'll get access to those free sports betting picks, which have been on fire recently. Also get the opportunity to participate in the ongoing discussion in Slack, but also get your questions answered in stream earlier if you ask your questions in the Office Hours channel there. If you're watching this and haven't already signed up for SaberSim, we do have a free 7-day trial on our site, SaberSim.com. So if you're interested in the product after watching the stream here today, sign up, join up the free trial there. And otherwise, I will be right back here again tomorrow, same time, 2 p.m. Eastern for tomorrow's stream. So good luck, everybody, in your contests tonight, whatever you are playing. And I will see you guys all tomorrow. Until then, take care. See ya.